In this video, I'll explore some of the key omissions from the Netflix documentary Missing: The Lucie Blackman Case. My key source for this video is the book People Who Eat Darkness, Love, Grief, and a Journey into Japan's Shadows by Richard Lloyd Parry. Lloyd Parry is a British journalist. He is the Asia editor of the Times newspaper in London, and he is based in Tokyo. The first omission is that shortly after her disappearance, Lucie's friend Louise got a phone call from someone claiming to be a certain Akira Takagi. This Takagi claimed that Lucie was alive and that she had joined a cult called the Newly Risen Religion, that she was in a place called Chiba, and that she would not be returning. Newly Risen Religion turned out to be a translation of the Japanese term for a cult or a New Age religion. For his book, Lloyd Parry interviewed Lucie's brother, Rupert Blackman. It was absolute pandemonium in the house, said Rupert, who was a 16-year-old schoolboy at the time. Mom was like a headless chicken. What do you do when someone goes missing in Japan? No one knew what to do. I was on the internet looking up Newly Risen Religion. The phone call from Akira Takagi was obviously a hoax, a red herring lobbed by someone who wanted to throw the investigation off the scent. The next omission is Lucie's father, Tim Blackman, and his financial dealings with the convicted murderer of his daughter, Joji Abara. In the book, Lloyd Parry writes, relating to the trial, here was the father of dead Lucie, setting out in searing terms the anguish brought about by her death, and pleading for the heaviest penalty. So it was all the more jolting to learn later that year that Tim Blackman had accepted £500,000 from Obara and signed a document questioning the evidence against him. You could say that in our culture, this is shocking and a betrayal of Lucie. In Tim's defense, you could also argue that in Japan, it's fairly common for the victims of crime or their families to be reimbursed by the guilty party as a way of making amends or showing contrition. The payment of cash from perpetrator to victim is a well-established procedure in Japanese criminal cases, frequently encouraged by prosecutors, writes Lloyd Parry. The book goes on to explain that Obara's lawyers had contacted Tim. This approach had first been made in March 2006 in the form of an email from one of Obara's lawyers. The offer was for a one-off cash payment of £200,000. In return, Tim would promise not to make a statement to the Tokyo District Court. Jane, Lucie's mother, received a similar proposal and responded with contemptuous rejection. But Tim entered into a brief email correspondence on the subject, although not, he insisted, to Parry at the time, with the intention of accepting the money. Negotiations stopped and started, and there was much underhand dealings. The book continues. Over the next 6 months, Tim resumed his exchanges with Obara's team. At the end of September, he travelled to Tokyo and met them in the New Otani Hotel. The timing was no coincidence. In October, Obara's lawyers would begin their closing arguments in his defense. Just 5 days before, 100 million yen, which at the time was worth about £454,000 sterling, was wired to Tim's bank account in the Isle of Wight. Tim accepted the money while Jane and Corrida Ridgway's parents refused the payment. All of this is absent from the documentary. In April 2007, Jane spoke out against her ex-husband Tim for accepting the condolence money from a friend of Obara. Jane and Tim's relationship was particularly fraught at this time. Tim wrote to the judge in Obara's trial, "I do not forgive the defendant in any way whatsoever. The condolence from his friend is accepted, just as we have received condolence from around the world." Tim also said that he intended to put the money into the Lucie Blackman Trust, which he established to advise young people on travelling safely overseas. The omission of Tim Blackman's financial dealings with Obara was probably agreed upon to secure an interview with Tim and his cooperation with the documentary in general, but this is only me speculating. The documentary says surprisingly little about Joji Obara himself, the killer. He remains this very shadowy, distant, malevolent figure. This is understandable, as maybe the documentary makers wanted to focus more on Lucie and her life. However, Lloyd Parry's book provides a clearer overall picture of Obara and perhaps why he ended up the way he did. As Lloyd Parry points out in the book, Obara's family were members of the population known as Zainichi Chosenjin, or simply Zainichi, the ethnic Koreans of Japan. In 2000, when Lucie Blackman came to Tokyo, there were 900,000 of them, but one could live in Japan for years and never be aware of their presence. They were an ethnic minority in a country which presented itself as racially homogeneous and undivided. Lloyd Parry suggests that historically the Zainichi in Japan suffered racism and discrimination that was even violent at times. He uses the example of the 1923 earthquake that destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama. After the earthquake, unfounded rumors began to circulate that Koreans were starting fires, poisoning wells, rioting, raping women, and looting shops. There was no reason to believe any of these stories. However, the rumors led to violent reprisals for some of the Korean Japanese population. I can only speculate as to what extent such discrimination was still present in post-war Japan and how it affected Obara and his family in spite of their wealth. I would suggest that Obara felt somewhat apart, other or different from his peers. Arguably, any discrimination would have fostered a resentment, indignation, and alienation in Obara. What we can say for sure is that Obara underwent plastic surgery when he was in high school to alter his eyelids. Obara claimed that the surgery was required after a car accident, but Lloyd Parry suggested that's not the case. He writes, "The surgery created eyes that were variously regarded as bigger, rounder, and more Western, and more attractive, and to many Japanese, and without any basis in racial science, less Korean. 20 years later, there will be a fashion for the expensive operation among Asian women. But for a high school boy at that time to have that kind of plastic surgery, well, that was very unusual," said Akimoto, a contemporary of Obara's in high school. And we also know that Obara changed his name. Lloyd Parry writes, in 1971, around the time he left high school, he went through the next stage of his metamorphosis. He changed his national identity from South Korean to Japanese, and he took on a new name, Joji Obara. But even before this, Obara was living a strangely solitary and independent lifestyle. At the age of 15, he left home and went to live in Tokyo alone with a female housekeeper to look after him. He was installed in Denen Chofu, another neighborhood of the very rich. Lloyd Parry suggests that the defining moment of Obara's teenage years was the sudden death in 1969 of his father, Kim Kyo Hak in circumstances that have never fully been explained. The father's wealth was divided between his sons and widow. At the age of 18, Obara had already been through three names, from King Sung Jong, the Korean baby, through Seisho Kin, the Japanese Korean child, Seisho Hoshiyama, the Japanese youth with round eyes, to Joji Obara, the ambiguous, unphotographable Japanese citizen. This term, unphotographable, Lloyd Parry brings this up several times in the book because there are very few photos of Obara. From a young age, he even avoided class and graduation photos. For a man who instinctively clouded his identity, who could not bear to be pinned down, captured, or summed up, even by a camera, it was appropriate that even his illegal name should be evasive. Finally, we also need to consider how the so-called bubble economy affected Lucie's life and Obara's life. Lloyd Parry writes, "This was the time of Japan's notorious bubble economy, the period between the 1980s and early 1990s, when Tokyo fleetingly became the wealthiest city in the history of the world. Anyone holding property became rich, whether they deserved it or not, and Japanese banks competed with one another to lend them money without asking very many questions. Obara, who had inherited several properties and purchased several more, became a very rich man during the bubble economy years. In his 30s, Obara put himself and his inheritance to work in the occupation which epitomized the spirit of the age, property developing. The excesses of the bubble economy arguably facilitated Obara's life of debauchery." Lloyd Parry continues, "The 80s and early 90s were giddy years in London and New York too, but nowhere was the consumption more conspicuous than in Tokyo. The grossness of bubble excess has become the stuff of urban legend. The nightclubs with mink covers on their lavatory seats, the cocktails sprinkled with gold leaf, and the banquets of sushi eaten off the naked bodies of young models. The mid-1990s represented the last wheezing gasp of Japan's bubble economy. There was still a lot of loose money in Tokyo." I would recommend Lloyd Parry's book. It provides comprehensive coverage of the case, and it's also a tribute to Lucie Blackman and Corita Ridgway, the lives that they led, and how they are still missed today.